I'm Rob Doubleday, Executive Director, Centre for Science and Policy, and it is lovely to see everybody here. As Nikki said at the beginning of the day, we at the Centre love our annual conference because it's just a great time to bring people together from different parts of our network, policy fellows in government, academics at Cambridge and other universities who meet them and come to our workshops, and perhaps even more importantly, new people who are about to join our network in various ways. So it's always a great day, and we're very grateful to you all for having taken part. We always like to pick topics that provoke discussion and thought, and we always hope that you will leave having learned some new things about the topics we've been discussing, but also, as importantly, you will have reflected on how you can draw more on the connections between research and evidence done in universities and elsewhere and government policymaking and delivery, and how by ensuring the conversations are working and the networks are well oiled, that we can get better outcomes for citizens and for the country. So we hope you've both been thinking and learning about the topic and also reflecting on the kind of the meta question about how to get these relationships to work well. And that's really the theme of this final panel. And I'm very grateful to be joined by three people who've been animating various of the panel sessions, who are going to reflect back a little bit on one or two things that they've heard that they thought were particularly interesting, or thoughts they came with that have been kind of honed through the day, with keeping in mind the idea that, this is ideas for our community, for how we can work better and deliver better outcomes. And then we're very grateful to Hannah White, who's Director of the Institute for Government, just down the pavement. So the Institute for Government, which Hannah will introduce, will be known, I'm sure, to all of you, that has very similar aims and objectives. It works in a slightly different way because it's set up in a slightly different way, but is a very close partner and shares a lot of our values and aspirations. And so we thought it'd be very interesting to hear from Hannah about how the IFG thinks about similar questions, but from a slightly different starting point. So that's how we'll run it. We'll hopefully have time for some questions and comments from the floor, and then in 55 minutes we will stop. I think that's right. Well, I've got it written down here. Yeah, 55. Yeah. Well, by 5:30 we will have gone. It says I have 15 minutes for closing remarks, which I'm not going to take. So we will, by 5:30, we will be enjoying the reception for more chats and reflect at the end of the day. But with that, I will ask John, Salma and Tabitha, who've been with us throughout the day, to give their first initial reflections, then Hannah, and then we'll open up for a wider discussion. So, John.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to open the closing session, I suppose. Right. A lot of interesting discussions, I think, that were had during our panel on disinformation and democracy. One thing with respect to kind of practical recommendations, did you know that you can buy 20,000 likes for your YouTube channel for a tenner? This is not a very well-known fact, I suppose. It is ridiculously cheap to buy fake things online that make you look much more popular than you really are. And with respect to regulation or policy, this market is wide open. You can just go visit these websites, completely unregulated. I think there is a time, probably that time is now, to look into this digital manipulation economy, which is not exclusively leveraged for the purpose of disinformation, but also for scams, crypto scams, for instance, and all sorts of other reasons ranging from the relatively legitimate, for example, someone in China registering an account in the UK to evade censorship domestically, right? That makes sense, all the way to someone engaging in political influence operations. And I think from a practical perspective, there's a need to approach this problem from the angle of market economics, microeconomics specifically. One thing that can be looked into by policymakers right now is what does it do if we raise the price of SIM cards in the UK? What are the positive and negative consequences of that? Because we know that the price of a SIM card is strongly linked to the cost of engaging in manipulation online. And then finally, I do maintain that it is a good idea that if someone is lying on the internet, someone goes and corrects it, right? And so that's why the panel had Kevin from Full Fact. I think that's a really, really good thing. Like in practice, how do we safeguard democracy? It comes in part by ensuring that like disinformation and misinformation become as expensive and therefore as unviable as possible, but also from making sure that good quality information is readily available to all audiences, especially around election times. So thank you.
Thank you, John. So there we go. Hugely important political and policy question, some concrete evidence-informed suggestions. There, of course, is an interesting gap then. What happens to those? How are they implemented? Salma, in a different top area, you might pick up some of those themes.
Yes, so I was chairing the panel on house building and how we are going to meet our 1.5 million target. And rather than talking about the specifics of policy, because if you missed it, I'm sorry you missed it, it was the best panel of the day. Let's talk about some of the themes that came out of it that all of you fellows, particularly those working in central government, will have to pay some mind to. The first was around politics and persuasion, is that no policy, no matter how much evidence is supporting it, is immune from the effects of politics and from democracy, local, national, and those pressures, and thinking through what are the things that we could do around that. And linked to that, the second theme is priorities. We had a really interesting, robust conversation around the pressures of regulation, like biodiversity net gain, on house builders, and thinking about actually how some of those policies are stymieing other policies. And so thinking about what is the balance and how do you weight those things across government, which leads into the third theme, which is policy silos. Actually, how can we break down communication, effective communication, between officials in various different departments, perennial age-old question. But how are we creating those networks and using that evidence and research to talk to each other across government? Because whilst you might have levers in government departments, actually, it's sort of network effects. We can have them in various departments in terms of the policy things that we need to address. So the big themes that I think we all need to take away and consider alongside policy and research is, again, politics and persuasion, priorities, competing priorities, and the policy silos that we have to break down.
Thank you. And that's hopefully what, a day like today helps with that task of breaking down those silos. Tabitha.
And also, I think believing that we can change those things is something that we discuss. So we discussed that economic growth isn't just about the railways, the roads, and the houses, and actually it's really about people. And we believe that the Cambridge-Manchester partnership that we discussed in our session will go some way to prove that. Serendipity, in the wonderful book that David has written, if we can live by some of those rules of engineering some of that serendipity, we should be in for a brighter future. But we also discussed that if we do that with the existing systemic inequality, we're going to continue to make things worse and worse for those who cannot partake in the game. And actually, we need to change the game for everybody to able to enjoy the benefits of serendipity. And in order to do that, we're going to have to break down some systems and institutions that we know and love in order to ensure that people don't have to lean in order to benefit. They need to be met where they are. And I'm excited to hear more about your thoughts on that in a moment.
Great, thank you. So that's not a kind of roundup of the day or even a summary of those sessions, but it gives some flavour of the kinds of conversations that have gone on and what John, Salma and Tabitha have taken from them. But Hannah, that's your introduction to the day. As many of you know, Hannah is Director of Institute for Government, formerly worked in Parliament and then in the Cabinet Office and Secretary to the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And we're very interested to hear from you about how the IFG thinks about some of these problems and what you're doing to try and tackle them.
Thanks. And I'm going to start by saying that Bob said I've had license to talk for slightly longer than the others, so I'm not just rambling on.
That's true. Please.
And hopefully this is going to be of interest. I'm really sorry that I haven't made it for more of the conference, and I'm going to make sure next year I've blocked it out in my diary so it doesn't get filled with other interesting things, and I can come for the whole day. So yeah, Rob suggested it might be helpful for me to talk a bit about how we think about making the work of the IFG relevant and useful to government. Our whole reason for existing is supposed to be to make government more effective, whoever is in government, whatever it is they're trying to do to make government better at doing that. And so we think a lot about how to go, how best to use our quite limited resources to do that. And so I thought I'd say just a word about, in general, how we think about it. What we think about in particular in relation to a new government. This was, for all of us, novel. We knew probably, a good year out that we were quite likely to get a new government. We sort of knew roughly the timing of the election in contrast to the few elections before that. So a bit about our thought processes and thinking about how to approach, how to influence a new government for the better. And then I'm going to say a bit more about some specific observations we've made about this government and choices we've made as a result of that, which hopefully might be relevant and interesting to you all. So our general model for thinking about how to make government more effective is to come up with new ideas, possibly based on new evidence, or just looking at the evidence differently about how government could work better. So we think about how to improve processes, how to make institutions work better, and so on. We don't think about policies per se. We think about the capability and skills needed by people who are in government, and we try to convene interesting conversations between people who wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity for those conversations or to talk to each other, to think about how things are going now, how to learn lessons from how things have happened in the past, and to think ahead to new challenges. So that's a sort of generic model. So when we think about a new government coming in, what of that is most important? I think there are probably three things. One is to help a new government think through the things it identified for itself as priorities in opposition. What does that mean when you get into government, and how do you translate that into a set of priorities in government? Actually a harder transition than I think many opposition parties think it's going to be. Second thing, how do you help a new government tackle the delivery challenges? And we've obviously had lots of interesting discussions about that, whether it's about breaking down silos or whatever. And we think about how we can help governments learn from past experience about how to tackle those delivery challenges. And then from a sort of individual point of view, the people who are going into government, we try to think about what skills they're going to need, what knowledge they're going to need, how we can help them accelerate up that gradient of being as effective as they can be as quickly as possible. So that's a kind of generic thought about a government. So what did we think about this new government? So obviously we've been observing them closely in opposition and as they've come in. And sort of drawing conclusions based on what they've told us in public, on how they've acted and whether that is in line with what they've said they want to do, and so on. And we've looked at the big events, the budgets, spending reviews, and so on to draw conclusions. And there are a number of sort of choices that we've made based on what we've seen. So obviously we knew that the Labour Party had been out of government for 14 years. So we thought it was really important to help them with sort of the basics of how government has changed since they were last in government. So a few members of the now cabinet had previous experience in government, but relatively speaking, actually compared to the Blair government coming in, they were more experienced, although that wasn't the sort of public narrative about them in terms of who actually came into some of those roles. But lots of stuff has changed in 14 years, and so we thought helping them to understand that, what's different, but also all the new people who'd never been in government, what the basics are. And so we did work with MPs, with select committees, and with new ministers. And we did work with the shadow cabinet ahead of the election, but also, as we always do ahead of any election, but also with ministers once they came into government, and with special advisors, who I think, some knows about their experience, but often are expected to get very rapidly up a learning curve in government, and helping them to do that we thought was important. With this government, as they came in, we were very open to the idea that there would be lots of interesting work for us to do on missions, and thinking about missions as a new method of doing government that was novel and was going to change the dynamics, maybe break down some departmental silos, change the way in which decisions were made about spending money and so on. Our observation is that the sort of mission idea doesn't seem to have had a big impact, actually, on how Labour is doing government. It's been useful, I think, for them, we can see in the spending review, in helping them sort of shape their spending priorities to an extent. Not all the missions have done as well out of the spending review as others. But so the mission sort of framing has been useful to us, and I think to Labour in sort of some of those choices, but not as a whole new sort of theory of government that we can get our teeth into and sort of really think about what that difference is. Happily for the IFG, this is a government which has said and has proven to be interested in process, interested in the how of government. Partly that is driven by the fact that they don't have a lot of cash to splash. So they can't come in and just throw money at improving public services. So the questions they are asking are about how can we make the processes better? How can we have, set up new institutions or get rid of institutions in order to do things differently and better? And so the sorts of interesting but geeky things that the IFG does, like think about how to run spending reviews differently, are things that they've shown interest in, and so that is something that we have continued to sort of try to throw out ideas on. We think they've definitely demonstrated an interest in regulation and in the role of public bodies, two more fascinating topics that the IFG is very interested in. So we've thought about, okay, so they're clearly interested in what role these tools should play for them in government. How can we help government think about what you should use a public body for? What is the rationale for having a public body, an arm's length body? And if you don't want them, how do you close them down well? And if you do want new ones, how do you set them up well? And what are the lessons you can learn there? So we've done some work around that. We observed, both in opposition and as they came in, that they are quite interested, and I think this will be relevant for lots of you, in this question of what evidence is. Where does evidence come from? And a lot of we had challenge in some of the sort of workshops we did with new ministers, saying, well, is what an expert tells me evidence, or is the lived experience of people who are using public services day in, day out more valuable? How can I, as a minister, make sure I hear those voices which I think are important and, to me, represent important evidence? Obviously not a completely new thought, but a different emphasis. So for us, when we were thinking about our work programme, we made a deliberate effort to think, okay, so we've done lots of work over time on the policy-making process, how to do policy well. It's been very Whitehall-focused. How do Whitehall civil servants think about policy? We've decided to do a project starting from a cohort perspective. So taking a cohort of citizens who are persistently missed by policy and trying to work from the bottom up to say, well, what is it about the policy-making process which means that, and we've taken one of the missions, the school readiness mission, and started to look at who are the children who are not school ready, which cohorts are not school ready and why, how far are they from the target that the government set for itself and why. And so trying to flip that round, and in our sort of research methodology, trying to talk, to be explicit about what we don't know. So we're trying to do this, we've narrowed it down now really, really granular to boys on free school meals, and we've put out a call to sort of say to people who work with and on academically boys, anything around early years and gender and these sorts of inequalities, tell us what we need to know about what might have been missing from the policy process that these children are being missed by it. So that was a kind of reflection on what this set of politicians were telling us they thought was interesting in terms of evidence to them, and trying to make sure that we were thinking from a different perspective too. Then another thing we observed was that the Labour Party, but not only the Labour Party, I think this is actually a global phenomenon now, politicians are increasingly interested in this question of what changes the lived experience of the voter, thinking that people don't vote just on, an affiliation to a political party, they vote on, the pound in their pocket and how they feel about the economy. And you can be a US voter and actually the economy is going gangbusters and still you blame the government for not delivering for you. So this thought about what is it that you can change about, as a political party, about how people experience public services and their sort of economic circumstances to make them think that things are getting better and to be a reality that things are getting better. And so there, we've always done work on the performance of 9 public services. We do an annual publication we call Performance Tracker, and we look at the money in and the performance on and the challenge and the pressures on different public services and compare them. And what we decided to do for the next round of this, which we're doing with Nuffield, is to look not just at the national level data, but also at the local data, and to look at variation in public service performance across the country, and also where we can to do some comparative work looking at public opinions of their local public services. So try to match up what it is about characteristics of performance of public services in different areas and whether that makes people more or less satisfied. So that was coming from that thought. They tell us that they want to focus on place. I think there's some little indications of that in the spending review, things like the community help partnerships. We think those things, it's really important to help governments think about piloting and evaluating, so we're thinking about how to do that. They're talking about efficiency savings, which government does not talk about efficiency savings, but that we're making sure we're doing work on how to shrink the civil service well, and that sort of thing. They're continuing to be interested in English devolution, completing the map, and that means we're continuing to work in that area. But, and I'm going to stop talking in a sec, I think it's really important to say that when we look at what we should be doing at the Institute, we are not just reactive to whoever is in government. We also try to be really proactive and think, what are the questions they're not asking? What are the things they should be thinking about? What are the challenges coming down the track? So a couple of examples of how we're doing that too, as well as offering support to the politicians who want professional development. We are trying to more proactively make the case that all politicians should want professional development, that these are really hard jobs that nobody is prepared for, and they should have ongoing support and L&D. We have decided to go out and make that case. It's not an admission of failure as a minister to go and seek that sort of support, to go to experts like all of you to ask questions. Curiosity and a growth mindset are a thing to be celebrated in political leaders. So we decided to be more sort of bolshy about that. We're also doing a project looking at how the civil service can build trust in politicians, can build politicians' trust in the ability of the civil service to deliver. Because we think, looking internationally, that is a question that all civil services ought to be asking. What are the things that civil servants can do to give politicians of all parties confidence that when they come into government, this civil service, this impartial civil service, will deliver for them? And so that is a sort of a bigger question, think piece that we're trying to do some work on. And the final thing, though, which, again, I think is probably relevant to lots of you, is that what we are also trying really hard to make ourselves do is think, when we've talked about a thing forever, when we're really clear, we've messaged out, about a recommendation that we have, and it doesn't have the effect that we hope. Why is that? Do we keep telling people till we're blue in the face that, that it's a good idea? Or do we take a step back and we say, well, why hasn't this happened? Is it that they haven't heard our idea? Is it that they heard it, but they didn't believe it, they didn't agree with it? Is it that they believed it, but they didn't do anything about it? Or is it that they did it and it didn't work? All these things are possible. And I think it's really incumbent on us as a research organisation to be challenging ourselves and not just to be constantly thinking of different ways. I mean, maybe it is about communication. It's easy to get stuck at the first one of those. Not just think about different ways, different people. If we just talk to more people, if we just tell them it in a different way, you know, it will make the change. Well, actually, maybe not. Maybe we didn't know enough when we made that recommendation. Maybe we didn't talk to the right people. And maybe if we did come up with recommendations, they weren't the right ones because they didn't have the effect that we thought they would. Yeah. And I think that that is just, you know, finally the kind of thing that we are trying to put that discipline on ourselves to make ourselves do.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to clap. Thank you. We're particularly clapping you, Hannah, by the way. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge agenda, and it does speak to some of the things we've been talking about today. I want to throw it open to you for comments and questions as soon as possible, as soon as you have questions and comments about some of the things we've heard about during the day, or what hasn't been mentioned that you found particularly interesting throughout the day, and some of the sort of cross-cutting opportunities and challenges we talked about in terms of how government can work better, how we in the evidence community, if that's where we sit, can support government to work better, and how that sits in the kind of political context, which is partly shaped by mis and disinformation, as John said, and the kind of relationship between what government can actually deliver and how people then feel and who they give credit to and who they want to hold accountable. Throwing it open to the floor. And yes, brilliant. Let's start with one of our wonderful policy fellows at the front. And yes, if you are happy to introduce yourself, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Is that on? It doesn't really sound like it. Oh, no, I think it is now. I'm Judith Herbertson. I'm head of the Girls' Education Department at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And as with all civil service departments, we're expecting to go through a process of shrinking the workforce to deliver efficiencies over the next 4 to 5 years. Very interested to hear what you were saying about the advice you've given to government and to the incoming government and those that are in charge of that process, which I assume may also have meant permanent secretaries and others. What are the sort of top headlines of what the evidence tells us nowadays about the best way to deliver that, to try to ensure that it's not your last point? We told them, they did it, it didn't work, or we told them and they didn't do it. Thank you.
Yeah, Hannah.
So the main thing that we observed from previous attempts to shift the size of the civil service that we advised against, and which I think we've had some success on, although I'm sure it's not just down to us, that's a sort of caveat for everything I might claim, is not to focus on headcount cuts. Because those are just so counterproductive. You end up employing consultants instead to do something. You end up allowing sort of natural wastage and then key people leave in jobs where you actually really do need people, but you don't replace them because you've got some kind of headcount, some kind of recruitment ban. So it's about really thinking strategically about your workforce and where you need people and actively managing that process, but also thinking about the money you want to save rather than the number of people. So yes, it is true that you can draw these curves of, you know, how the civil service was cut from 2010 down to 2016, and then it's gone back up to the same and beyond, and that is very striking to politicians. But I think that it appears to me that the Labour government has got the message that setting a headcount target. You know, we saw it happen repeatedly under the Conservative government and it was never met. Numbers continued to creep up. But if you focus it on budgets, I think that is the better way around to do it. Sam has probably got thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, but I'm going to take a panel privilege and ask you a question, actually, because I find the IFG's work incredibly interesting.
But then I want you to get back to this. But ask your question, and then we'll
So the thing that I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on is because there's a lot of people here who will be working to ministers, producing advice for ministers, and will deal with awful yet effective people like me, which are known as special advisors. And there was a brilliant, it's Kath Haddon, one of your colleagues at the IFG, who had a brilliant description for the way the civil service sometimes treats ministers, and it's like as a child god, which is everything sort of comes down from these ministers, and their words are golden, but they must be fed, and they must be watered, and they must be taken care of. So it's this very odd dynamic. And I wonder... I think
Gillian Keegan has a mug with that on.
Right.
She liked the phrase so much she had a mug made.
Wow. It is quite compelling. But for me, when you think about how you're bringing evidence and research to bear, what is the best way of communicating that? Because you talked about the IFG being bolshy, and I think that lots of politicians would really welcome their officials sort of presenting them with facts in a much more robust way than perhaps they do. And I wonder if there's any advice that you can give people to be able to act with more confidence and more certainty, and perhaps being a bit more bolshy with their ministers.
So I think it depends very much on the minister. And I suspect that civil servants tend to get conditioned by the ministers that they've worked with, and they have had quite a variety of different ministers to work with in recent years. And I think that, it's understandable that if you have a minister, I'm not saying all ministers are like this, who sort of says, this is the policy I want to pursue, give me the evidence that justifies it, that doesn't incentivize you to go away and think, okay, I'm really going to start from zero base here, what are all the options, how can I, because that is not what's wanted, and that's not what you'll be rewarded for. So that is obviously the worst case scenario, but I think that it can also sometimes be iterative, that if you've had that experience once, you are more likely to self-censor. And it is a massive generalisation to say, but I think that over time there has been, a sense that the civil service has got itself into a place where it's not always its first instinct to say, okay, we're going to be as challenging as possible and provide all the policy options here. It's more tempting to try to slightly second-guess what it is that the answer that the minister's going to want. And different ministers are just very different in this, and I think some of them are... Sometimes you'll get ministers who say, can't stand it, we have these meetings, there's 100 people in the room, I don't know who I'm talking to, I'm going to issue an edict, I'm never going to have more than 3 people in the room with me. And they need to be the right 3 people, and some people will say, those should be the people I really trust, and my advisors, and one other, and others say, I want to know the person in the department who actually knows about this, rather than the person who's briefed the person who's briefed the person who doesn't actually know about it by the time he gets to the minister. Other ministers are much more open to, let's have a conversation. I want to hear people debate this in front of me. And then I will come to my own conclusions. And that people do just have different intellectual styles, I think. So I don't think there is one answer fits all.
Great. I've got a lineup of people asking questions, but I was going to turn to a policy fellow for a comment, not a question, if I may. Graham Pendlebury from...
Hi, thanks, Rob. Graham Pendlebury, I was the director of the Department for Transport. My comment would be in regard to the observation about should you be more bolshy with ministers, is that, no, you shouldn't be bolshy with ministers, and you should never say no to the minister unless it's in an extreme circumstance. So the traditional civil service approach is to say, OK, Minister, I hear what you're saying, I understand what it is that you want to achieve, and this is how we can help you. And you might then steer them gently towards where the evidence is pointing, but always bearing in mind what their ultimate goal is, but taking them away perhaps from their initially daft, proposal. You help them to get where they need to be, but without ever saying, no, you can't do that, that's a stupid idea.
I mean, just to add, one of the things that, sorry, Rob, one of the things that's coming out of our Civil Service Trust project is that a lot of ministers coming into government find it very frustrating when they have the civil servants who do exactly that, who say, I'm sorry, yes, but this is a bit more complicated, and have you thought about X, Y, and Z? And to an extent, that is completely inevitable, because when you're in opposition with 2 advisors, and you're coming up with a topic and you've only got so much time to go and talk to people in and around the ecosystem, you won't have understood the complexity, you won't have the full detail, and you will have come up with your great idea that you're really wedded to. And so there is an inevitable clash then when you come in and you talk to people in the civil service and they're like, well, actually, you know, we did try that last time, what we thought about that. And it feels like the civil service is saying no. You're not explicitly saying no, but it feels like you're saying, but, you know, if you'd really thought about, you know. And so that is really tricky. Like, well, this is one of the things we're trying to think about, how to manage the expectations on both sides of that, because it is definitely the case that it's, I mean, I don't know whether you sort of would concur, Salma, but there's definite phenomenon that lots of ministers report coming in.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's important that we have this conversation because there's several people in the room who are in their first year in the civil service, particularly on the science and engineering fast stream. So, you know, it's interesting for you, I hope, to reflect on your own experience and then in the context of this conversation. Is it specifically on this topic? Okay, yes, so at the back in green jacket. And I know, Ian, you're next one.
Hi, I'm Marie Southgate. I'm Prison Policy Director at MOJ and also a Policy Fellow on CSaP. We've spent a lot of today looking at graphs going in the wrong direction, whether it's demand for public services, spending, the number of civil servants, and so I'm particularly struck by the comment Salma made about getting ministers and the system of government to really grapple with competing priorities. Do you have thoughts, maybe particularly Salma and Hannah, but indeed any of the panel, about how we can speak truth to power and really surface those big blocks of different priorities and try and help government make choices between them if we can't afford to do everything? Thanks.
And other people in the audience might, I mean, in one of our panel sessions, we were asked a tough question like that. So the person that asked that question in our panel might want to comment on that as well. But Salma, over to you.
Yeah, speaking truth to power is quite hard, isn't it? Especially, you know, as Hannah says, people come in, they think they've got great answers, they're on this super high because they've won a majority and they've got this lovely shiny new job, and here you are taking the shine off all of that by speaking truth to power. I mean, the corporate answer is quite simple. It's about open, transparent communication and trust. So you've got to demystify it because, you know, I think this was true for me when I went into government, which is I didn't really understand it. I would have loved to have had an IFG, certainly, assist. And I joined CSaP whilst I was in government, and it was incredibly informative, but it took a long time to get there. So you need to work out how to truncate that process. And I think it is about that openness. You know, as we just heard, yes, Minister, I hear you, but here are the things. Let us try and work something around it. So it's never just a no. It's here's what we can work with, and here's how we're going to help you be able to sell it. Because, you know, it is an enormous amount of pressure to be a minister where you're going in largely as a generalist with a political team that may not understand the policy or the intricacies or the complexities. And they do need a bit of hand-holding, but, you know, respectfully so, which is why this child God moniker is so fitting. But I think you have to appreciate their vulnerabilities as well, which they really don't get an opportunity to express. They live in a world of definitive action and certainty, and explaining complexity is not something that's easy. I mean, you know, Miles Gibson here and I were on a panel earlier about house building, and that idea of persuading the public, you know, without giving them that certainty, without giving them that definitive route, is a very difficult thing to do. So as well as developing the policy, there has to be some mind to develop how you're going to communicate and sell that in a difficult situation. It's not party political, it's just about the policy. And I think the civil service needs to get a little bit more comfortable with that selling marketing piece as well.
Yeah. I mean, and I might ask Tabitha to reflect on this, because I think you've been sort of an expert working in government, probably coming across some of these same dynamics. Do you want to comment?
Yeah. So from 2017, for 5 years, I chaired the government's AI Council, and saw a lot of different ministers, as you alluded to earlier. And one of the things that I think was really interesting was that the desperate need for definitive action. And what we offered was not that. We offered a lot of disagreement, a lot of open conversations between different walks of the AI ecosystem, and believed at the time that that was the right way to enable ministers to understand where the trade-offs might be and hope that that meant that they and their teams would come up with better solutions. And I think that we did some really, really good work in that guise. But when the new government came in, I think what they needed, they sort of reverted back to too many people telling me lots of different things. I would just quite like the answer. Yeah. And I don't begrudge them needing the one definitive answer. And I think that that is something that from now I'm back on the outside rather than that very uncomfortable grey area I was in, because I was never actually in government. I'm seeing a lot of recovering science advisors feeling the same, which is, how could we have done that better? Like, how should we be giving advice in a way that is disagreeable, but then we can commit to something a bit more definitive? And I don't have an answer, but I think this is quite a good forum to start thinking about what that might be.
Can I just say there, Tabitha, I think some ministers, as sympathetic as I am to their vulnerabilities, do need to understand that it is sort of their job to come up with a definitive answer, and perhaps reminding them of that from time to time might be a good thing.
That's why we need you, I know.
Thank you. Ian, take us in a different direction.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Ian Burstone. I work for Innovate UK, part of UKOICE, one of those public bodies you mentioned, Hannah. Two questions and comment as such. One of the things that I worked on in Innovate UK was regulation and how it influences innovation, can drive innovation, etc. And obviously the previous government, Rishi Sunak kicked off in Chancellor, did a lot of work on regulation. So I was just wondering what, and Innovate UK at that time did a piece of work on independent study that showed the Innovate UK was the third best economy in the world for regulation for innovation. An independent report. And so I'm just wondering where you think the government is going to go with the thought of regulation. It does seem to be being pushed towards innovation. And secondly, missions in particular. I think we all understood the mission, the original big mission, where a lot of the thought and thinking of Marianne Mazzucato and others come from, the moonshot, but they had one ultimate mission, a man on the moon. There were KPIs along the way, but the final KPI is a man on the moon. At the moment, the missions are very diffuse, and I haven't seen or heard of any of them even really being broken down, any KPIs, any particular pieces. Do you think that, I can understand publicly not wanting to go with some KPIs, but do you think that the missions are slowly drifting away just because they have found them so hard to put into policy that actually they can measure?
Great. Hannah, do you want to take the missions question first? And then, I mean, it might be good to get the other panellists on regulation. I mean, John, you started talking about regulation from your point of view, so it'd be good to bring you back in on how you see the value of regulation. But Hannah, do you want to start on the missions question?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. They sort of maybe inevitably in setting 5 things that a new incoming Labour government would do, they were drawn quite broadly. One of the things we argued in a big piece of work we did ahead of the election was that it was never going to work for any government coming in. You always have your kind of sort of big high-level objectives, which in this case are framed as missions. Then you have your manifesto, which is 497 specific commitments designed to appeal to every single constituency you can think of wanting to appeal to. But you're always going to need a middle layer. And we used the example of the programme for government developed by the coalition government, which was, by sort of necessity, had to be developed. And in many ways wasn't that brilliant, but it was a list of things they said they would do because they had to hammer that out between the two parties to say, okay, these are the things we're getting and these are the things you're getting. And that, our understanding is that was quite useful for civil servants as they went on through the coalition government because, it was there to refer to. Now, you can argue about whether it's as easy to do that if you don't have two parties to have to come up with a list like that. But we tried to argue that it was something all governments should aim to do, to very quickly after they come in, take the manifesto, take the sort of big things and try and draw up the sort of list of deliverables. It took a little while, but just before Christmas, the government did sort of set out its milestones within each of the missions, which I think are a sort of a version of this, the things that it says it is going to aim towards doing in this Parliament. But, you know, and then there are whole sets of questions about what sorts of incentives those different targets and so on set. But you're absolutely right that for a government that is trying to hit lots of different bases, because there are lots of things that need fixing and lots of priorities they have, having something as simple as but you know, as clarifying as putting a man on the moon is difficult. We've shown that actually the UK civil service can do that when you have COVID. You know, when you have something which is a very clearly externally imposed priority. You know, we're actually pretty good at sort of marshalling behind that and doing the crisis response. We find it really hard to do it not in peacetime. And one of the things we think is that that's to do with the way in which Number 10 is and the centre is organised. The centre is not very good at being strategic. And to answer the previous question about driving priorities and trade-offs at the centre, if you look at the spending review process, it still ends up being mostly bilateral between the Treasury and different departments. You know, it's not you haven't got that mechanism at the centre that really forces anyone other than the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to be saying, well, is our priority over here or over here? And it's too much comes down to those personal relationships between those people.
Great. Tabitha wanted to jump in on this, and then I'll go to John and Salma on regulation.
Can I ask, do you think that the question that this government is asking you around lived experiences and how to make the voters' life better might change that? Because they're going to have to pick something, whether it's how much a hamburger costs or whether their children are ready for school. Could this be the moment that they're going to have one priority?
Yes, I mean, I think they focus grouped it, and I think that the answers they've come up with are waiting lists. Yes. Because almost everyone, you know, either themselves or someone in their family or someone they really care about is on a waiting list of some sort, and can you change that? I think the other one is visibility of police on the streets, which is why they've said, you know, they set a target of recruiting lots of police, which has lots of knock-on effects then in the system for courts and prisons and all the other problems.
Your job.
I see the lady at the back nodding. But that is a thing that is noticeable to people, and so it's an attractive thing to go for. So, I mean, you know, no target is perfect, and targets are always gamed, and they always have lots of other effects on the system. Doesn't mean they're not sort of a useful mobilising tool in some circumstances.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
So, John, this is your case, you know, your chance to talk about, you know, the case for regulation for you know, pro-innovation, positive case for innovation. And then Salma, you might answer Ian's direct question, is where do you think this government's going on regulation if it has a kind of big coherent picture on regulation?
So during our panel, someone, I forget exactly who, brought up the point that within the space that I find myself in, right, which is the information ecosystem kind of, and how to regulate and how to understand it type of space, the thing you immediately run into is the discussion of freedom of speech, right? And you want to be extremely careful to not accidentally or not even not accidentally introduce a set of regulations that are either kind of directly impacting on a genuine, honest person's ability and willingness to express themselves in a political manner or otherwise, right through government intervention. So you want to be extremely careful because we consider this right to freedom of speech to be sacrosanct. Of course, there are limitations and so on, but in principle, right? And so that means that you don't want to do that directly, but you also don't want to make the regulations so convoluted that that is what happens accidentally, more or less, right? Or sort of as an emergent property of a system. And so in that sense, I think the focus of the Online Safety Act, for instance, in the Online Safety Bill, has been primarily on that. And someone else during the panel also brought up the point that, like, this regulation especially has been approached from the perspective of the consumer of information, right? So what rules can we implement on these platforms, let's say, that we use to consume or information, or any information, not just misinformation, at the consumer level, right? And that is proving to be extremely difficult, because that's when you immediately run into this problem, right? And so my call for innovation, I suppose, within this regard, is to not look at kind of, or well, also look at, but to switch focus, to switch tack perhaps, from focusing on kind of the reliability, I guess, of the content that we see, right, towards the authenticity of the content that we see, right? Because in principle, you could make a case that I don't really care what you say. You can say something like, I love Vladimir Putin in the UK without any repercussions, and that is a right that we hold very dear, and that is a good thing, right? Even though none of us in this room, I presume, have particular sympathy for Vladimir Putin. I personally do not. But it is something that you are allowed to say without any repercussions or fear of repercussions from the government, right? But if you are, if I am paying an influencer with 20,000 followers on Instagram to say, I love Vladimir Putin, right? Then all of a sudden we can attach a value judgment to that act. Not the expression, I love Vladimir Putin, but my act of paying that person to say it, which is a thing we know happens quite regularly. It's just that we don't know how regularly it happens, who is doing this systematically, et cetera, right? But within the context of innovative regulation, right, this angle, I think, can actually be fairly productive because you're explicitly staying very, very, very far away from what people are talking about, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Salma.
So two aspects, I think, to your question. One is the KPI piece and evaluation. And I think that that is something, another theme that that has come up, and indeed you've talked about it, Hannah, which is how do we revisit what we've done before and how do we audit it? Well, the ability to audit is dependent on the KPIs and the metrics and being able to meet it. And I think it's very important for arm's length bodies or organisations like Innovate UK to have a conversation with the officials in the department to say, our recommendation is this is how we go about evaluating it and asking the minister to then sign that off. I think it's really important that that just exists as standard and it doesn't necessarily consistently across the piece, and I think that would be very helpful to be able to hold governments to account and hold oneself to account and the public purse to account correctly. On the second aspect around regulation in general, I sort of worry with the missions as well, as you say, because they are so diffused and nebulous, and it's sort of, missions sort of looking for a plan, not a plan that's got a mission. We have to try and understand that we are sometimes a bit reactive. Politics is very reactive, and our system quite often gets taken over by the urgent, and there isn't really that capacity in the system to kind of keep going with business as usual. And I'm not sure we've really ever addressed that. I think all governments, it doesn't matter what colour, you have an issue with like the CMA. Microsoft is angry at the CMA because it's hitting growth or it's impeding growth. Or a conversation we were having earlier about tech companies and a trade deal with the US getting really upset about a digital services tax. And again, it's very hard not to respond to that. But governments of all colours, as I say, need to sort of think a little bit more strategically about the way they want regulation to work and in whose interest they are creating regulation. So there's got to be a bit more of a first principles conversation around that. And that might well mean that there are problems with our regulators. I mean, I don't think there's anybody in the room that would say that, perhaps Ofwat wasn't regulating as well as it could have around governance structures of water companies. It's not about blame, it's about really having that audit trail and trying to be more structured in the way that we think about our regulation and not being so reactive.
Great. I'm going to take a final round. Well, good, we've got a final round of questions. We've got loads. Okay, we might have two quick rounds. So let's take questions from this side. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sam Stevenson from the University of Cambridge. I was struck just looking at the kind of thing behind you and the tag for this, of resilience in a changing world, and thinking about how much has changed in the past couple of years and maybe how little has changed in the kind of activities and the structures of government, both within the kind of politics level and then maybe in the civil service. And thinking about kind of some conversations around what do you say to a minister, not say no to a minister, but kind of redirecting them in a different kind of direction, and what that means for how the government does big things in a world that is changing, and how you kind of then reorientate the civil service into doing that, and not just in its kind of thing at the moment. And sorry, very quick, as a kind of junior researcher, kind of having my entire educational process after the financial crisis, is there a kind of a way in which we're not afraid to say things are changing and things need to change, but there might be a generational issue around that as well? Thank you. Great.
I mean, that's a huge and important question. I'm not expecting the panel, just to be clear, I'm not expecting you to necessarily answer all these questions, but but it's a great one, Sam. Thank you. Good. Yes.
So it was also somewhat related to the OK, yes, Minister, but, and the not wanting to communicate uncertainties to the Minister because they want a simple answer. Studies during the pandemic showed that people in test groups, people who were given a very clear vaccines are good, get a vaccine message, and vaccines have these positive impacts, these risks, these drawbacks, there's a range of uncertainty. The reception in the people that were given the uncertain message, this is just in the public, was more positive. More people took up the vaccine in that group, and there was more trust with the communication. So if there's a need to communicate uncertainty to politicians and the public receives messages better if there is honest uncertainty in it, is it maybe more important that we just get the ministers and the politicians to accept uncertainty in their messages and pass that communication on?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
More good questions?
I'll keep it short.
Thank you.
Missions and diverse and diffuse messaging. I can understand if any of you want to take a bite on answering this, but how is the government doing in terms of messaging, and how is it doing in terms of controlling the narrative and the agenda?
Great. And I think, did you want to come in right at the front here? And then we'll close it. That's your half of the room. That's your lot.
Hello, I'm Miles Gibson. I'm a former senior civil servant, worked in Number 10 in the Treasury. I wanted to ask about failure. I'm a student of tax policy failure. Not pasty tax, but land tax. And I wanted to ask about speed of failure and tolerance of failure, and the way in which research and evidence can help politicians change tack quickly when it's become apparent that something has gone wrong. And we did touch on this in the panel, because certainly when I was a civil servant, I felt that research was taking so long to generate that by the time the answer had appeared, the question had changed. And so what I'm finding right now is that the most influential people on my thinking are actually lobby groups and interest groups who have an agenda and are FOIing the government like crazy in order to get the data so that they themselves can do the analysis that is then influencing the debate faster than the civil servants are able to influence the debate, because they have to go through an enormous number of reasonable and risk-assessed judgments about what kind of research to commission. And what we really need is a bit of tolerance, I think, in how rough and ready the research can be before it affects a decision. I'm just interested in any comments on that.
Great. Well, 4 really great questions, and they're not actually sort of linked with each other. I really hope you're not going to all answer them completely, because we're going to run out of time. But if you want, Sam, on the world's changed, has government changed, and is there a generational aspect? How to think about communicating uncertainty both to and from ministers. It's a question about narrative, getting a grip on narrative, and then the question about failure, evidence, who's doing the evidence. Can I ask you each to be brief on one or 2 aspects of that? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to take. I'm going to group the last 3 questions together, because there is a lot of similarity there, and it's completely interlinked. And communications is my day job. It's my professional life. Failure and the means of communication and the method of communication has completely transformed, and this links back to Sam's point. what we used to do in terms of being able to brief a small cohort of people in the parliamentary lobby about public policy and politics, that's completely broken apart. And that, speaks to Miles's point about campaigners having their own means of communication through social media platforms. And this is where, John, your work on disinformation is really critical. Government has, generally speaking, lost control of those means, and they haven't really adapted to this new world reality. It is why, when you put policy and research out, quite quickly it can be torn down. But I think it does mean that the manner of our communication, in terms of allowing a bit more complexity and not just having three-word slogans or trying to reduce everything into the simplest form possible, there is more allowance for complexity in that communication. Government just hasn't caught up with it. So actually, it can take a headline in a traditional media outlet, but actually still not have the fundamental impact with stakeholders or the general public or its own, brand. So I think there does have to be a change there. It totally links back, though, to Sam's original point, which is, since the financial crash, there are certain things that I think Western liberal democracies just will not accept, and that is 2008 financial crash. We've never actually recovered from it. And so we keep talking about policy as if we're in a pre-2008 world and as if we're ever going to get back, to that place, carrying on doing the same thing over and over again. And I think there is a window of opportunity here to be more radical, to really test the boundaries. But it's incumbent on all of us, not just the politicians or the people who are elected or, the bag carriers like me that turn up with them. It's incumbent on all of us to try and push those boundaries and barriers and get more comfortable with explaining the complexity there.
So can I just build on that?
Please.
So I think that's absolutely right. And so when my team came to me and said they wanted to do a piece of work on rapid policy making, my reaction was like, no, there's a good way to do policy and we don't want to encourage people to do rapid policy making. Actually, it's exactly the right question. There are times when policy has to respond more quickly, and what are the parameters about how you do that well? What are the inputs that you need to be able to get? How do you go about it? And just sticking your fingers in your ears and going, oh, no, this isn't how we want to do it, isn't actually the right answer. So my team are obviously absolutely right. So we are doing a piece of work on rapid policy making, and I would be really interested in any thoughts anybody has about those questions. To go back to the Sam's original question and be slightly depressing. I think there is, as Rob said at the start, I worked for a long time in Parliament, and I do think that we do think a lot of things in government actually very differently now to how we did, and we do things in Parliament very differently to how we did 10 years ago. The experience of Brexit, the experience of COVID, the rapidity with which we now legislate, and the expectations that MPs have of their ability to scrutinise legislation and things have completely changed. And there are very few MPs left in Parliament now who were there pre-2016. So the institutional memory point in government, there's also been rapid turnover in the civil service. So when people who've been at the IFG for a long time say, well, this isn't how we used to do things, there isn't actually, apart from the very top of the civil service sometimes, that much institutional memory of how things have been done over time and what the baseline is. Sam is absolutely right. We're not going back to a golden age, so maybe the baseline is irrelevant, but actually I think it's sometimes quite hard to compare expectations of what you might do in a different situation with how things have been done over time.
Either John or Tabitha want to come in?
I have some ideas based on those 3-4 questions for panels for next year.
Great.
So I think that the first is we need a panel, to your point, Sam, about resilience, on how we're going to govern in a world where the political divide is on gender for 18 to 24-year-olds, and how we're going to govern in a world where Gen AI will control all the information flows. Because I think your point about resilience is those two things have completely are not really being discussed enough, and will completely change the game. And then to your point, I love that study. I need to find the study about the uncertainty, and I would love to have a panel, and maybe you've done this in the past, but on rebranding the U-turn, because I've never really understood why that's such a bad thing. I've always thought that was success. And to your point, is this not something we should be celebrating, because everything is going so quickly? So maybe that's the panels for next time.
Great.
Final point, I suppose. I think within the broader political context, right, democratic politicians are looking at the communication styles of those who are doing better electorally at the moment, and some of them do not particularly hold, let's say, the truth and corrections and so on in particularly high regard. And so the risk that I think exists is that politicians from across the political spectrum look at that phenomenon and think, like, well, apparently that's just what works, right? I don't need to self-correct. I don't need to apologize for a fib. I don't even need to care particularly that I'm telling a fib whatsoever, or even an outright lie, right? And if that self-corrective mechanism kind of ceases to work for mainstream politicians, because they look at sort of non-mainstream politicians, if you will, and see that as a rewarding strategy to a degree, we are moving further away from accountability rather than towards it, right? So that's not something that we want exactly. And so in that sense, right, like what should we prescribe, I suppose, as researchers and advisors and policymakers to our politicians in terms of the preferred type and style of communication? I think the earlier point, I think was that the study by John Kerr that you mentioned? And colleagues from the Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication is possible, because I know that they've done similar work on that, where it turns out that being open and honest about the potential risks of what you're proposing doesn't really backfire. It does almost nothing for the people who are already agreeing with you. For example, people who already wanted to take the vaccine are unaffected by communicating the risks of vaccines. And people who were not already going to take the vaccine, this is just one example, right? They're like, yeah, I kind of appreciate this style of communication. I'm still not going to get vaccinated, right? But I do appreciate what you're telling me. That's great. That's nice that you're being honest, right? Obviously, the alternative is that they find that information elsewhere and believe that the government has been hiding it from them, right? So that's why openness and transparency in communication, even if it makes you look bad, quote unquote, is something that I think the evidence justifies. So in that sense, right, like there must be a way to communicate that transparency is good for you as a politician, right? Like being transparent, being open, including about the things that aren't going particularly well, is a good idea, and that's also why the best evidence.
It tends not to be.
I know. I'm not a politician, so I'm lucky in that sense.
Just to say,
I get to sort of yell from the sidelines. It's nice.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll stop there.
Great. I'm now going to perform a U-turn. I had promised this half a chance to ask questions. I'm now going to invite you to hold on to your questions and ask them over drinks, which are going to happen in a moment, if that's okay. What I want to do is wrap up with just a very few words of thanks. Thanks, of course, to the sponsors of the conference, Cambridge Zero, Centre for Pandemic Risk Management, Owen Overton. Thanks to the wonderful team here at the Royal Society who've looked after us so well. Thank you to the CSaP team that put it on, organised it, and looked after us. Thank you to the chairs and speakers throughout the day, including the panellists that wrapped the day up. And, of course, thank you all for coming. So with those words of thanks, I'm going to invite you to join in a big round of applause to thank everybody, and then join us for drinks afterwards.